Phillip is by far one of the most impactful characters in Overlord. Not only was he the single person responsible for destroying the entire kingdom, but he was also the only person to claim victory against the Sorcerer Kingdom. A spectacular accomplishment we unfortunately never got to see in the anime. So, if you're wondering what exactly it is Phillip did to beat Nazarick, well, here's an entire video dedicated to how it happened. But first, this video is sponsored by Nikke, an immersive sci-fi RPG shooter that actually brings a new form of exciting gameplay I've never seen before. As a commander who recruits a bunch of waifus to form this squad of Nikke, you'll find it very easy to get into the game's simple and intuitive playstyle of point and shoot. One that's not only exciting for its beautifully styled fast-paced real-time combat, but is also complemented nicely by visual assets and vivid character designs, accentuated by some of the best 2D blended animation I've seen in a mobile game. Combine this with a fully voiced story in Japanese and English, collectible top-tier waifus you can instantly play as, then a double-faceted setup involving both characters and weapons, and what you get is a captivatingly stunning action game of strategy. One that can get surprisingly extensive when choosing which Nikke to combine with which gunfire strategy. Since all provide different perks and buffs, you can easily create the optimal team for whatever the mission calls for. Then, with various other features like co-op battles, puzzles, and a roguelike wave mode, there's plenty of other things to keep you entertained even after the campaign. So, if you're looking for a unique shooter RPG with aesthetic waifus and an entertaining gameplay loop, then I highly recommend using the link in the description to download Nikke for free today. There's plenty of launch rewards to be gained, and even a global creator competition to kick things off. Plus, be sure to check out the CDK NIKKELUV as well. But now, let's get back to the video. In order to fully understand the true magnitude of Phillip's genius, we first need to understand the perspective under which he was operating. I did mention it back during the cut content from episode 8, but the general idea was pretty much this. AINZ's stockpile of goods that were currently held in the kingdom was actively preventing Phillip from selling his own at a profit. So long as the Sorcerer Kingdom continued to maintain such a massive supply of provisions, they would always be able to determine the price at which those provisions could sell for, thus preventing the local nobles from selling their own at the price that they wanted to. That being the case, the only way Phillip could come up with to overcome this problem was by simply doing something that would diminish the Sorcerer Kingdom's supply. If they could just lower their yield by, say, stealing supplies from one of their convoys, then not only would he be doing his nation a service by stealing from an enemy, but it would also encourage merchants to flock to him. I mean, he would after all become the courageous hero who struck first against one of their sworn enemies. Once word of that got out, it would only be a matter of time until merchants would be lining up for him, at which point he could just sell them the very crops that he'd stolen, making this a triple-faceted plan with significant benefits. So, with the genius idea being to levy his villagers and attack the convoy in 𝑑𝒉𝒊𝒑'𝒔's domain, Phillip would proudly present his plans before setting off to bring them to life. What the anime didn't show after was that all this was a clever setup from the two nobles who were with him, specifically this one here. You see, as a noble who had come into power through a similar means as Phillip, it was only natural that he too become part of the faction Phillip was leading. It's not like he enjoyed being led by such an imbecile, but considering that these were the cards that he was dealt, 𝑑𝒉𝒊𝒑'𝒔 had no choice but to play along with them. So, knowing all too well that his faction was the one of misfits, 𝑑𝒉𝒊𝒑'𝒔 concocted a plan to bring about change from the inside. He would present himself as this weak and insignificant noble, then use that image to place himself under the wings of a greater power, an important trait only hinted at by 𝑑𝒉𝒊𝒑'𝒔's lackluster outfit. It was very subtle in the anime, but the reason he had gotten so visibly upset from Phillip ruining his outfit was because that was a core asset in maintaining his image as insignificant. He didn't dress as this formal aristocrat who came from riches, but instead chose a more common garb to get people to lower their guard around him. Then, by doing just a little bit of brown-nosing, that was all that was needed to gain control over a brainless idiot like Phillip. A few sentences and a bit of positive reinforcement from 𝒔 was all it took for 𝑑𝒉𝒊𝒑'𝒔 to lead Phillip right where he wanted him. That said, Phillip alone was only part of the problem. With the Sorcerer Kingdom stockpile still sitting in the capital, that was the core thing preventing his faction from becoming better. You see, because many of his fellow nobles were only noble in name, most had no interest in managing their domains at all. They were all like Phillip and completely useless, drunk on the power that fell into their laps, all while believing they were each destined for absolute greatness. So, when confronted with the obvious issue of a foreign power controlling the price of their crops, even with 𝑑𝒉𝒊𝒑'𝒔 indirectly pointing out how this was bad, most nobles he talked to believed they'd come out on top. They believed that by growing cash crops and selling them at a premium, the excess money they would make would just be used to buy provisions from the Sorcerer Kingdom. It was, after all, a readily available stockpile they could just buy from whenever they wanted. The point no one seemed to understand, though, was that this was exactly what the Sorcerer Kingdom wanted. They would wait for the kingdom's harvest to inevitably fail, then jack up the prices of their own product when they become the only supplier of it. An obvious play intended to make the kingdom dependent on the Sorcerer Kingdom. That being the case, the only way 𝑷𝒉𝒊𝒑 could come up with to prevent this from happening was by doing something about the Sorcerer Kingdom's stockpile. If he could somehow get rid of that foothold on the market, perhaps the nobles who saw it as this opportunity to grow cash crops would instead reconsider and start managing their domains properly. With no backup supply that they could just purchase from, even these moronic nobles would see that they have to grow real crops, that or end up starving for the winter. The core problem with a plan like this, though, was that you needed a special kind of stupid to attack the Sorcerer Kingdom. A person so dumb and so gullible that 𝑷𝒉𝒊𝒑 didn't even think it was possible to find someone like that. So, when Phillip agreed to do exactly that, 𝑷𝒉𝒊𝒑 couldn't help but think that Phillip was trying to play him instead. It was truly hard to believe that Phillip was that dumb. Perhaps what was going on instead was that Phillip would follow through with the attack on the convoy, then pin the blame on him since the attack was going to happen in his domain. I mean, that seemed much more likely than just straight up stealing from the Sorcerer Kingdom. If that was going to happen, though, 𝑷𝒉𝒊𝒑 would simply ambush the ambush, then gain favor with the Sorcerer Kingdom after having defended their convoy. It was a plan that should work so long as there were no survivors. Either way, as long as the convoy was attacked by Phillip, there was definitely some sort of benefit to be gained from it. At the very least, Phillip was sure to be removed from their faction, but perhaps the Sorcerer Kingdom may even withdraw their stockpile. If the kingdom proved themselves unable to defend their goods, then perhaps the Sorcerer Kingdom would lose trust in the merchants that they were hiring. That was the outcome that would by far be the best case for everyone. Now, if you're wondering why 𝑷𝒉𝒊𝒑 was going so far to incite change, well, that's simply because he wanted to make things better. He didn't have the money or power to do it himself, but what he did have was a single, genuine desire to improve the quality of life in his own domain. A task that wasn't possible unless the kingdom itself started to change. So, with a single passion to make him and his people's lives better, 𝑷𝒉𝒊𝒑 was willing to put in the hard work needed to get it done. Work that he knew needed to start from within his own faction. If he wanted to move up and create the better life he so desired, then the necessary tools for that were achievements and connections, both of which could only be gained by starting with this faction of rejects. Now, despite this being extremely risky, even 𝑷𝒉𝒊𝒑 didn't believe this attack would result in a war. I mean, for one, he never thought Phillip would succeed in the first place, and a convoy like this was way too trivial to get so worked up over. Combine this with their small territory and limited numbers, and 𝑷𝒉𝒊𝒑 believed the worst case scenario was the loss of a few more border provinces, something that didn't affect him since his domain was at the other end of the country. Fast forward to the actual day of the attack, and out of all the villagers Phillip attempted to recruit from his entire domain, only 50 showed up to take part in this. It was a feeble showing considering his call had gone out to everyone. Then, to make things worse, the people who did show up didn't even look like they were capable of fighting. Most were well past the age befitting that of a capable worker, and their unkempt demeanor dictated they were the village's outcasts. So, with only dead weight given to carry out his plan, Phillip couldn't help but feel that his people weren't appreciating his genius. They didn't seem to understand the tremendous benefits such a mission would bring them. But even so, Phillip was still certain that this was where his legend would begin. As the first and only person to strike a blow against the Sorcerer Kingdom, Phillip was sure the kingdom would shower him in glory for it, perhaps even reward him by giving him the hand of the princess. Many of the people alongside him didn't think the same, but when they had asked if this plan would actually work, Phillip reaffirmed his thoughts and stated how their actions would save their country. Of course, no one truly believed him, but their lack of faith only showed just how short-sighted they were. Only a brilliant mind like Phillip's could truly grasp the extent to which this plan would benefit them. Now, it was after Phillip and his men were settled that 𝑷𝒉𝒊𝒑 and 𝒔 would show up with their own forces. 75 each hidden deep in the forest on either side of Phillip, thus bringing the overall number of troops to 200. When Phillip heard that that's how the troops were deployed, he immediately recognized the layout as the legendary crane wing formation, an inverted wedge-like shape that numerous war heroes had used before him. Of course, with Phillip knowing nothing about the actual purpose of it, there was a bit of confusion when 𝑷𝒉𝒊𝒑 explained how retreat was all part of it. You see, when Vianney had asked which way Phillip would run when the battle got started, Phillip mistook this question as Vianney saying that he would lose. What Phillip wasn't understanding though was that this retreat was simply a facade in order to get the enemy forces to chase them. It was the whole point of setting up in this formation in the first place. They would make it seem like they were losing the fight, run away to lead the enemies out of position, then quickly turn and have the forces on each wing come and flank them. That was the plan with which Phillip and the others would proceed with. They would wait in the forest until the convoy could be seen, then jump out in an ambush and begin their attack. One last thing to note about the setup is that despite Vianney and Ig using masks to hide their face, Phillip's full plate armor was too hot for him to keep his helmet on. So rather than continue to keep his identity hidden, he instead decided to proceed with the helmet off, leaving his face in the open for all to see. Now, while Phillip and the others awaited the convoy, a large portion of the story was spent showing the perspective of the merchant in charge of it, a man currently in debt to the Eight Fingers who also just so happened to be a member of their smuggling division. So, when the time came for him to start paying that loan back, part of that payment involved transporting goods for the Sorcerer Kingdom. It was a job he never imagined he'd be a part of, yet here he was leading the convoy alongside a group of mercenaries. With 24 guards all part of the Eight Fingers payroll, the safety of these goods were all but guaranteed. Reason being that mercenaries like these who were part of the Eight Fingers were highly loyal and extremely trustworthy, much to the point that if things started to get dicey, Christopher knew each of them would defend the convoy with their life. If they didn't, then the Eight Fingers were sure to hunt them down and kill them anyway. That said, despite these guards being handpicked by the same clients he worked for, Christopher still wished for someone stronger, preferably someone from the Six Arms. But ever since their supposed defeat in a 1v6 to Brain Unglaus, the best he could hope for was what he had now. A group of mercs who seemed far more relaxed than they should be. That's not to say they weren't good at what they did, but considering they were traveling with the flags of AINZ, the probability of someone attacking them was extremely low. Plus, anyone foolish enough to even try that was either starving bandits too ignorant to know who they were up against, or a rival syndicate trying to create trouble for the Fingers. Either way, the lead mercenary was confident his group could take on both those threats. Like, even if they were outnumbered 200 to 24, if all they were up against was a bunch of bandits without any combat experience, then him and his group could easily take on all of them. Funnily enough, it was shortly after this comment was made that the advance guard brought news of a potential ambush up ahead. The reason they saw it only as a potential ambush was because the people waiting and hiding were nothing but villagers. They weren't bandits or thieves equipped with any sort of weapons, but instead simple townfolk carrying nothing but farming gear. So, the fact the most dangerous thing they carried was a simple hoe, Christopher couldn't be sure that they were actually ambushing him. And because it was very possible they were actual farmers, sending men to chase them off could send off the wrong message. If word got out that the Sorcerer Kingdom convoy messed with farmers, then Christopher would be the one responsible for having caused that. That being the case, he couldn't risk doing anything that would reflect poorly on the nation he was representing. So, after considering potential possibilities as to why 50 people were out here, Christopher decided the best thing to do was to scout the surrounding area first. Since the villagers' positions were so blatantly obvious, if farming wasn't what they were there for, then it was very possible they were there to bait for a bigger trap. A seemingly incompetent group intended to lure the convoy in. When the scouts returned after finding nothing though, Christopher could only conclude that these people were just farmers, an assumption reinforced by the lack of additional troops, but quickly proven wrong when the villagers stepped out to stop them. They didn't immediately attack like how an ambush should have been, but instead just stood in the road to form a roadblock. It was a confusing sight since many of the people blocking them looked scared to be there. They didn't seem like they wanted to fight, but instead stood with a look of pure uncertainty. Plus, if they were planning to attack, then even a complete idiot of a leader would have had them stay in hiding. Because they were all out here standing in the road though, that meant that this was something different. Something Christopher could only find out by confronting the people directly. So, with a merc to defend him and another to attack, Christopher would leave the convoy to talk to these villagers. He would state his purpose from behind the safety of a tower shield, then await a response from whoever was their leader. When that leader turned out to be a noble he recognized, Christopher's mind toiled in an attempt to understand what was happening. First, he tried to comprehend why Phillip was in a domain so far from his own, but after hearing how he was here to disrupt the business of the Sorcerer Kingdom, Christopher's only thought was to eliminate the threat in front of him. It was right before he was about to give those orders, though, that Christopher began to feel as if something was off. He remembered that Phillip was working for Hilma. So, if this was truly the same Phillip who worked for the Eight Fingers, then there had to be a reason why he was doing this. I mean, no sane nobleman would attack a convoy from the Sorcerer Kingdom, let alone one who was stupid enough to show their face like this. So, since Phillip's face was right out here in the open, perhaps his true intention was to let Christopher know it was him. Or maybe the true culprit was simply using the illusion spell to make it seem like Phillip was behind this. If that was in fact the case though, then that meant the villagers behind him may also not be what they seem. Then, with such an idiotic pretense of attacking just for the sake of stealing food, Christopher was certain it was everything other than that. What I mean is that the idea of stealing from AINZ was so incredibly stupid that Christopher was absolutely confident something else was going on. It could be a rival syndicate, a betrayal from within the Eight Fingers itself, a secret plan intended to force him to kill Phillip, or even a larger plot designed to provoke war between the two kingdoms. There was a limitless number of possibilities under which this situation could have arisen from. One thing Christopher knew for sure though was that Phillip definitely wasn't here just to steal food. So, as he continued to contemplate all the reasons why Phillip would be doing this, Christopher decided the worst thing to do was to kill him. If he acted rashly and killed Phillip right away, then not only would the act be perceived as a Sorcerer Kingdom convoy killing a kingdom noble, but Hilma might directly punish him for killing one of her pawns. At least if he let Phillip live and gave him the convoy, he could always report back to Hilma and use Phillip as a scapegoat. So, with that train of thought influencing his decision, Christopher decided it was best to just leave. As long as Phillip didn't chase or attack any of his men, he would abandon the convoy and just walk away. At first, the mercenaries believed Christopher was under some sort of spell, but after seeing just how serious he was when giving the order, they reluctantly accepted and departed as well, thus granting Phillip his victory over the Sorcerer Kingdom. Phillip would have preferred they left the horses as well, but when a hidden archer shot an arrow right next to his head, Phillip felt it best not to push his luck anymore. So, while he did have these massive wagons of food prime for the taking, unfortunately he had nothing to move them with. Even so, considering the goods were his and no one was hurt, Phillip still believed this to be a flawless victory. He was, after all, the first and only man to successfully steal a flag from the Sorcerer Kingdom, and that would be his prize for this amazing accomplishment. So, as he trampled over the other flags representing his enemy, Phillip couldn't help but consider himself this brilliant tactician. I mean, not only did he do what no other person could, but the success of this operation had all but proved it. He had followed through with the act that would prove his greatness and was now in possession of the spoils of victory that confirmed it. It was everything he needed to affirm the glorious future ahead of him. But yeah, that's pretty much the legend of Phillip. We may not see him again till the very end of the season, but I assure you the fate he meets is one befitting that of his intelligence. And that's the video I'll be making next. Until then though, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!